This is a picture of Stephen. This picture was taken just a few months before he died of a stabbing in Roxbury. This picture is a picture of my mother. This picture was taken just a few months before she died of breast cancer. Both of them are buried relatively close to my house, so they ended up in virtually the same space, but how they got there was completely different. I was working at the bar and actually studying for the bar at the same time. Those of you in law school, you'll get to know how that is. And I remember the first time she called me, and I got annoyed and just sent my phone to voicemail because she knew that I was working. And then she called again, and I remember thinking like, okay, something might be wrong, or she's just had too much wine to drink tonight, so let me just send it to voicemail again. And then she called a third time. And this time I stepped into the walk-in refrigerator at my work and heard the words that no child ever wants to hear. First, it was just nothing, just silence. And all I could say was, Ma, I'm working, what do you want? And then I could hear her crying and saying, I'm afraid. I have stage 4 breast cancer and I'm dying. From that moment, from that critical moment until the end of her life in a hospice bed, there was one question I never had to ask myself. From those first few moments of learning about her diagnosis to those last few moments of watching her expire in a hospice bed, I never had to wonder whether or not my mother was getting the best treatment from the best people, using the best equipment and the best medicine and the best hospitals in the country. Seeing through her terminal disease and seeing her humanity in it, switching from palliative care to diagnostic care, despite our meager means and her dire diagnosis, my mother was cared for like any patient that we would expect to be cared for in the United States of America. Medicine is as prehistoric as we are. With the first surgery occurring about 7,000 years ago, archaeologists in France found the remains of a prehistoric boy whose arm appeared to have been surgically removed using a stone tool. And they surmised that aside from that stone tool, the surgeons at that point in time used some plant-based antiseptics to numb their pain. But as science and industries innovated, so too did those practicing medicine. Leech bloodletting and drilling holes in people's heads gave way to prognostic and diagnostic care. Vaccines and antibiotics changed the way that we reacted to medicine. Instead, we tried to prevent it. Wars demanded that we treat traumatic injury differently. The expansion from country to city gave us special concerns about public sanitation and community health. The advent of the microscope changed the way that we thought about infectious disease, and so on and so forth, until we got to the point where the stone tool was replaced with microsurgeries with lasers. Unlike those in the medical system, however, those in the criminal justice system have avoided adaptation for tradition. Despite advances in understanding the intersection between poverty and crime, between the traumatic reasons that people commit violent crime, between addiction and why people commit crime, all of the things that go on in children's lifestyles and the manifestation of those things and the commission of crime, we have practiced in virtually the same way since the advent of our profession. A healthy community is a safe one, and oftentimes those people who are the last lifeline of folks coming to court are the first responders in those courthouses, including prosecutors. And instead of being given the best and the latest technologies and tools to solve that information, we are taught to think about winning cases. Stephen came to my courthouse for the first time when he was 16 years old. He was arrested by the Boston Police Department for threatening another teenager of a shooting. Despite the fact that they didn't find a handgun, they still arrested Stephen and charged him with possession of a firearm and assault with a dangerous weapon, and he came to my courthouse. It didn't take us long at all to figure out that if we didn't do something immediately, Stephen would either be the victim or the perpetrator of a serious violent crime. His mother was terrified that we were going to lose Stephen. She thought that by bringing him to the courthouse, he was going to be in the best hands, our hands, my hands. In the time that I knew Stephen, he touched our public systems hundreds of times. He went from public school to public school. He lived in public housing, and he wasn't in public housing. He was in foster home after foster home after foster home. He was kicked out of at least 11 different schools and had 28 foster home placements by the time that I met him. He was arrested by our local police, the school police. He went through a juvenile justice department, mental health facilities, local jails, the adult justice system, and finally, adult prison. And despite the fact that Stephen went through all of these things, we continued to use the same iteration of solutions for his behavior. Arrest, new school, new foster home, runaway, suspension, arrest, jail, punishment. Simply put, we were using crime solutions for mental health and public health problems. We absolutely blew it. Stephen was born in Cape Verde, and he grew up in the small island African nation in abject poverty, where he witnessed unspeakable violence against his mother and suffered abuse on his own. And what he was witnessing and what he was experiencing taught him to use violence as a tool for everything. And as he learned, that behavior began to manifest and made his mother think that the best thing to do was to move to Boston with Stephen to go and be around the supportive network of his family in Boston. When he got here, Stephen was 11 years old. When he got here, because of his language barrier and because of his behavioral issues, he had to skip the 5th grade. And so he stayed a year outside of school. And in that year, he began making friends with the older Cape Verdean kids in his neighborhood who had been living there for some time, creating their own environment. Finally, after that year, Stephen was allowed to enroll in school, but having no treatment for his mental and behavioral health issues, his behavior was met with suspensions and expulsions, further detaching him from school, further arresting his educational development, and further allowing him to spend more time with Cape Verdean gang members in his neighborhood. And for the first time in his life, Stephen felt something that felt like protection, loyalty, love, responsibility, agency. And because of those things, Stephen was led to a life of more serious crime. Stephen came to my courtroom presenting all of the symptoms of learning disabilities, of malnutrition, of post-traumatic stress, of adverse childhood experiences. And yet, our response to his behavior was not trying to understand and treat. It was trying to punish the behavior out of him. Instead of trying to understand and treat Stephen's behavior, we were focused on the word of the law and deciding whether or not it was broken, instead of focusing on the broken person who was in front of us and doing everything that we could to treat him so that he would not come back. But every single time Stephen showed up, the response was the same. Arrest, new foster home, new school, runaway, suspension, expulsion, arrest, repeat. I am not unique. This is true of the 31,000 prosecutors who are around this country. Every day we are met with people who are at the worst point in their life and need help, and we are taught to open up our toolbox, use a stone tool to fix that problem. That stone tool is incarceration and punishment and oppression. This is probably the first time that you heard of Stephen's death. He died in this city while he bled out in his friend's car in our neighborhood of Roxbury. And despite the fact that Stephen's death was entirely preventable, despite the fact that he touched our system hundreds and hundreds of times, you didn't hear about it. Despite the fact that because of the times he touched our public systems, all of those systems had the information to intervene and do something for Stephen, you never heard about it. In fact, when I researched When I looked for an article about Stephen's death, I found one. It said, "Black man, 19 years old, stabbed to death, investigation to continue." We were using crime solutions for public health problems. We knew that Stephen's behavior was about medical and health problems, and yet we chose to punish him. Imagine your doctor punishing you for heart disease because you worked too hard. Can you imagine your doctor incarcerating you for your diabetes because you ate too much sugar? Imagine going to jail for lung cancer because you smoked too much. Imagine if that's the world that we lived in. Now imagine that doctor is brand new, fresh out of medical school, and all they're equipped with is a stone tool. We would never let that happen. So we have to ask ourselves, why do we let it happen to the Stephens in the world? Imagine what that newspaper article would have looked like if my mother died because the people who she met on the worst day of her life did not have the best tools, the best education, the best equipment, the best medicine to solve her problem. When I think of Stephen now, I think of this. A 16-year-old boy getting his permit and being so happy that he found this new place in his life. Does this look like to you a violent and serial criminal who did not deserve the best treatment that he could have got on the day that he came to us on his worst day? Imagine if we failed my mother the way that we failed Stephen. Like Stephen, my mother is buried not far from my house. My mother died despite doctors' best efforts to treat her. But because she died, it doesn't mean the doctors weren't trying their hardest, that they weren't the most educated, they weren't trying to use the best medicine, the best tools and techniques. It means that my mother is saving lives because doctors learned and adapted. And that's what we need our criminal justice system to do, because we are failing. There are millions of Stephens and Stephanies we will never meet, that will never be in the empty chairs in these rooms, because the criminal justice system is being allowed to run the same way it was during its inception centuries ago. Imagine never knowing what your loved one could have contributed to this society, what your loved one could have been, who they could have married, what children they could have had, what business they could have started, what art they could have made. Imagine that. Because Stephen's mother will never know. We will never know. I don't want to be here next year. It should be somebody else. Stephen, perhaps. And until we start demanding that our criminal justice system takes care of the Stephens and Stephanies and the millions of people that you will never meet, that I have the fortune and privilege of meeting every day that I walk into an impoverished neighborhood, into a prison around this country, until we start demanding that, we are depriving ourselves. We will never know what we missed out by Stephen not being in this red circle. Perhaps the next big idea worth spreading. Thank you.